Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Prez of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined again by Keith Preston, and we are going to take a somewhat little different of a turn here. As anybody who's listened to us knows, that we've had some quite in-depth discussions on the failings of British and U.S. foreign policy in the past century, and even in the present day, and how that has deleteriously affected the world we live in now. Oftentimes, the defenders of this particular narrative will argue that it was inevitable, that it was the morally right thing to do, and that, if we didn't win this U.S. Civil War, we didn't beat Germany, the whole world would be so much worse off. And I think the venue of alternative history is, of course, speculative, it does have a use in this context to help us frame, if things had happened contrary to the status quo, would it really have been worse off? Would the world really have been worse off if the Confederacy had won the Civil War, or Germany had won World War I, or even World War II? And so by looking at alternative history, we can sort of put a alternative spin, because, someone who comes at this from a normie perspective is like, well, I guess it wouldn't have been that bad if the South had won. We'd have slavery in 1980s, and people, don't have any sort of reference point to come from. And so I think in that sense, some exercise like this is somewhat useful, and then it provides an alternative reference point for someone to look at. And I think in the 20th century, before we get started, the North American continent is extremely vast and rich in natural resources. And the amount of political and military and economic influence that the United States has wielded throughout the 20th century is a direct result of that. Now, that continent had a century of peace after the Civil War. Now, a united North America is pretty much undefeatable, and it can really just throw its weight in and really upset the apple cart. Whereas if the Confederacy successfully leaves the Union, we don't have that anymore. North America is now no longer one united country, but it's at least two and possibly more. And what that will then do is it has a lot of ripple effects, a lot of things that the United States was decisive in, like World War I and other conflicts, would go very differently. So I think it behooves us to start with the Civil War, because that has the most opportunity to change the reality that we saw now. And so the typical narrative is, well, if the South had left or had won or had whatever and the Union was broken, well, we still have slavery today, and the Nazis would have conquered the world, and so we had to defeat the South. So I guess, Keith, why don't you paint us a broad picture of, okay, the South has left the Union somehow, maybe through a war, and has allies with Britain and France. What do you think the likely outcome of that would have been, as contrary to the doomsday sayers?
Well, if the United States had been essentially split into two countries in the 1860s, if there was a Southern Republic and a Northern Republic, you would have had two countries that essentially had the same system of government living side by side. The Southern system, of course, would have continued to have been a more agricultural society, and while the North would have continued with the industrialization process. Eventually, the South would have started to industrialize as well. Of course, the big issue that was associated with the Civil War was slavery. Southern slavery would have survived for a longer period of time, but it would have been phased out eventually, for the simple reason that it was not economically efficient and not technologically efficient when compared to more mechanized forms of agricultural production. Eventually, Southern slavery would have been phased out the same way it was in Brazil. In the late 19th century, Brazilian slavery was ended without a civil war, and largely for the reasons I'm describing. It was simply, it had expired its historical utility, I suppose is the way to put it. So you still would have had a somewhat more conservative traditional society in the South, and then you would have had the Northern Republic. I think that probably one major impact of the South winning the Civil War would have been that the westward expansion would have taken place at a much slower pace. Once the South was defeated in the Civil War, one of the main things that happened afterward was that the Union armies continued to advance westward for the purpose of conquering the Indian territories. And of course, the westward expansion continued to go on throughout the rest of the 19th century, on into the 20th century, and so on. So eventually the entire North American continent was conquered by the United States, and the indigenous cultures were wiped out or forced onto reservations and things like that. I don't think that the outcome for the indigenous people or the American Indians would have been nearly as bad. I think that quite possibly we would have ended up having some actual American Indian nations on the North American continent that would still be here today as independent nations, quite likely. So we would have the Northern Republic, the Southern Republic. Perhaps Texas would be a republic in and of itself. Texas was actually an independent nation at one point. We would have multiple American Indian nations. And of course, as far as the Pacific expansion, we would still have the Kingdom of Hawaii, and or Hawaii would largely be an independent nation, along with some of the other Pacific territories as well. So we wouldn't have this continent-wide empire that we have, that the United States is, and which extends into the Pacific. I think that's probably the main geopolitical outcome. Now, when it comes to other things, in terms of the economy, we may not have seen quite as rapid economic development in the United States, because one of the things that led to the rapid economic growth of the United States in the 19th and late 19th and early 20th century was the fact that the United States had this massive single national market where you had access to all of this, all these natural resources, which had been taken through the South through conquest, agricultural resources, or in the West through the same thing, through the conquest of the indigenous nations. So it's possible that the rate of economic growth would have been slower. I mean, the United States still would have been an industrializing nation during this time, but it's not quite as certain that the level of industrial development would have been quite as advanced by, say, the early 20th century as it became. So that may have happened on a slower pace. Perhaps Canada also would have remained more influential in the long run. Canada essentially has a status of being a subordinate junior partner to the United States and North America. I think the relationship between those two countries probably would have ended up being more equitable. And then, of course, Mexico as well. I think that Mexico probably would have retained a higher position on the North American continent than it did. You wouldn't have had the United States as this continent-wide empire that dominates the entire continent. I think that's really the main difference that would have happened if the South had won the war, as far as the consequences for North America. But I also think there were important consequences for the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, I think, as you pointed out, the Pacific interests of North America, of the United States, would not really exist. So one obvious and salutary effect of this is that Japan is given a largely free hand in Asia. And again, as anyone who's listened to our discussions on World War II and American foreign policy, our leaning on Japan really opened the floodgates to communism. And it was a complete utter disaster, not only for Asia, but for the world. At worst, Japan was no different than any of the other autocracies that had ruled China, from the emperors to the Mongols to anything else. It's just par for the course. And second of all, Japan was a Western nation, unlike the communists or the imperial Chinese. So in many ways, from the point of view of Western negotiation, the current problems we have with North Korea and China being semi-Westernized totalitarian regimes would not have been the problem with Japan, even if Japan had created the greater Coast Asia prosperity sphere. And without active U.S. interference, that's quite likely. They would have been a Western power that would have had reasonable demands, that would have played within the broader European coalition of powers. It would have been one more power that was essentially Western, rather than dealing with these crazed totalitarian regimes that are still giving us a headache in the Far East. So in that sense, that's one obvious difference. Now in Europe, the obvious difference is that Germany wins the First World War. I think largely Europe would have continued to develop much along the same lines it did historically if the United States had split in two. Because that I don't think directly affects Eastern Europe, the Balkans, or Germany. It might indirectly affect them in how World War I plays out, possibly the United States being a German ally. But what we would see is Germany would probably still gain hegemony over the German peoples, and France and England would probably still be envious of that and seek a war. But Germany would win such a conflict. the author of the War for the Union, Alan Nevins, in his 1960 work, writes this: "It is hardly too much to say that the future of the world as we know it was at stake. A conflict between Great Britain and America would have crushed all hope of the mutual understanding and collaboration which led up to the practical alliance of 1917-18 and the outright alliance that began in 1941. It would have been a vastly more difficult, if not impossible, the coalition which defeated the Central Powers in the First World War, struck down Nazi Germany in the Second, and established the unbreakable front of Western freedom against communism." Well, yes, but of course, if Germany wins World War I, there's no need to fight Nazis and communists. So the latter two are irrelevant. But Germany wins in Europe, and we didn't really explore, and we can maybe table this to a little bit later in the conversation, but there are reasons to believe that a German victory in the First World War was preferable to what actually turned out. So we see a more stable Asia led by a somewhat authoritarian but Western nation, Japan. And we see a Europe that's not racked by fascism and communism. And this is because the United States doesn't have direct interests and, in fact, can't impose its will on those regions. And I think right there we see a massive global change that's more positive than what we actually saw. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, World War I really had the effect of ruining much of the world. There was a quote from Bertrand Russell where he said, "No one born before 1914 knows what it's like to live in a happy world." And he was talking about the world as it was prior to the First World War, and then the consequences of the First World War. The First World War was a disaster for Western civilization. The way that the war was sold in the Western powers, in Western Europe and in North America, was as a war to defend democracy against Prussian militarism and German reaction and authoritarianism, which is a fairly ridiculous way to frame that particular conflict when you consider that at the time Germany was arguably the most advanced nation in the world. And yes, they were a monarchy, but they also were a parliamentary monarchy. The Socialists, an avowed Marxist party, actually had a significant number of seats in the parliament. In fact, they were the one, it was their votes for war credits in the period leading up to the war that made the war possible in the first place. So the idea that Germany was some kind of backward, retrograde society during World War I is ridiculous. It was a very advanced culture with very advanced science and art and technology and industry and all of that.
Just real quickly interject here. Germany also had the most advanced protections for working class people in factories. I think of any country in the world, they were the most progressive in worker rights.
Well, yeah, they were the most progressive in a lot of different areas, and of course, the fact that the Allies during that war sold the war effort as a war for democracy, that was mitigated against by the fact that Russia, the Russian autocracy, was actually allied with the Allies. And which was the same thing that happened in World War II, where it was supposedly a war for democracy, with Stalin being supposedly being in the democracy camp. But Germany was destroyed, ruined by the war. And what made World War II possible was the outcome of World War I. If Germany had not been totally defeated, if the Allies and the Central Powers had simply fought to some kind of standstill or stalemate, or a more equitable resolution of the war had resulted, you wouldn't have seen the things that happened in Germany after that. You wouldn't have seen Germany totally being destroyed by the war, then having these humiliating terms imposed upon them by the Treaty of Versailles. And then, of course, that led to the rise of the extremist movements that you found in Germany during the Weimar Republic, the National Socialists and others. And then that led to the Third Reich and World War II. All of those kinds of, that whole series of events could have been prevented if the Second Reich under Kaiser Wilhelm had not been given such a decisive defeat in the Second World War. I mean, in the First World War, and that probably would not have happened if it had not been for American intervention in the war. It was really American intervention in the war that gave the Allies the upper hand that they needed to really destroy Germany. And not only that, but if you look at the terms of surrender that were imposed on Germany, it was very ideologically driven. It was very much about this idea of we're going to punish this backward Prussian monarchist militarized society. It's not just, well, we're just going to end the war. It was all about enacting a kind of victor's revenge on Germany. And of course, the idea of getting even for what happened in World War I was a big way in which the Nazi movement actually sold their own program, and that had a lot to do with the coming to power of the Third Reich. And of course, if it hadn't have been for the coming to power of the Third Reich, we wouldn't have had the Second World War and the virtual ruin of most of Europe that came out of that. All of the older European colonial empires were destroyed because of the Second World War. And then the Soviet Union ended up seizing much of Europe and bringing it into its own orbit as a set of vassal states. And then, of course, after that, we had the arms race. We had the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we had the arms race, the nuclear arms race, and then the geopolitical rivalries and all of these regional wars in Korea and Vietnam and places like that. So the whole 20th century was set in motion by the events of World War I.
Exactly. One thing to refocus back to North America is we've mentioned in our discussions that these utopian ideologues that have driven U.S. foreign policy in World War I with Wilson's 14 points, and in World War II with, the whole Brotherhood of Nations and UN, which the danger of these ideologues, as a libertarian say, a humanitarian with a guillotine, is that there's no compromise, because if you're compromising with evil. If you compromise, it's Manichaean, black and white. If you compromise with the Germans or the Japanese or whoever and make a more moderate demand, it's like compromising with the devil. Whereas in earlier wars, like the ones that the Europeans used to fight, well, you get a little bit of this, I get a little bit of that. It's, not the best for both of us, but we're happy enough that we don't go to war again, like after the defeat of Napoleon. I think the big loser in a U.S. Defeat by the Confederacy and maybe Britain would be that these ideologues would be thoroughly discredited, because a lot of the drivers behind Lincoln's War were these utopian progressive people like abolitionists and Unitarians and transcendentalists, the people who would later become, the 20th century WASP elite, who then were supporting England in World War I and World War II. I think in a lot of ways, those political parties, those political ideas would have been discredited. People would have blamed them for the war that the Union lost, and they'd be like, well, we don't want to try that again. I think also the Republican Party would be finished, be associated with the complete disaster that humiliated the United States. You might even see the rise of populist parties instead, because I don't think the United States would be a one-party state. But with the discrediting of the New England cabal of Whigs and Republicans and egalitarians, it might lead to a sort of populist party that would take its place, which could conceivably have been led by a William Jennings Bryan figure, which wouldn't have been that old bad at all, because William Jennings Bryan was actually opposed to intervention in Europe and generally was a guy that was more interested in developing the United States at home or rather than abroad. But I think those are maybe some. And furthermore, the largest ethnic group in the United States, even at the time of the Civil War, were German Americans. And I think in all likelihood, we would have sought a closer alliance with the Germans, with the Prussians, because we would have had a lot of Germans in the United States, which would have been an influential force. We would have felt isolated by the British and the French and would have sought allies abroad. So I think those are reasonable expectations from a U.S. defeat in the Civil War. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, in terms of how the northern region itself would have evolved, I think you've got a point that the Republican Party, Lincoln's Republican Party, would have been discredited as a result of the North having lost, because, first of all, the Republicans were a new party at the time. They had only been formed, I think, in the 1850s. And what they were was a coalition. They had emerged from a coalition of smaller parties, the remnants of the older Whig Party, and the Whig Party is just was a British classical liberal party, and the American version was really just the American version of this British party. But the Whigs and then some anti-slavery parties, and then the Know Nothings, which were a nativist party that opposed Catholic and Irish immigration. All of those parties collectively became the became the Republican Party. So that was a new party in the 1850s, and Lincoln was their first presidential candidate. I believe he was their first presidential candidate. He was certainly the first Republican president. And so I think his party would have certainly been discredited if the North had lost the war. And I think that you would have had a lot of recriminations for that in the North. I think you would have had a lot of people, similar to what you were saying about how a lot of people would have looked at the ideological zealotry for the war that had emerged in the North with disdain after that, saying, well, we listened to you people and look what we got. Because there was a very ideological component to the Civil War. I read a book on the Civil War probably about 20 years ago, and I can't remember either the name or the author. But it was one thing that was said in this book was that in terms of what was motivating the two sides in the war, in terms of the just not only the leadership, but just the rank and file troops, is that on one hand, the northern armies tended to think of themselves as crusaders. They're fighting for a cause or an idea, whereas the southern forces tended to think of themselves as fighting for their sense of place. They're merely fighting for their country. They're fighting for blood and soil, whereas the North is fighting for ideology. And in fact, if you look at some of the songs that came out of the Civil War, like the Battle Hymn of the Republic is the obvious one, the most well-known one. But if you read the actual words to that song, it's basically like a quasi-religious war hymn. In fact, a lot of people today think of it as being a religious song, but it's actually a war song, a fight song. But it's got this kind of quasi-religious theme to it. But it's also got this very apocalyptic, crusader type of dimension to it as well. But I think that kind of thinking would have certainly been subject to more criticism had the North lost the war, and that would have probably reduced the influence of those kinds of thinking. You mentioned some of the previous cultural and intellectual currents that had helped shape that, the transcendentalist and Unitarianism and abolitionism and all that. Yeah, I think some of that would have probably been less popular as a result, and along with that, some of the other things that came later, like the progressive Christianity, which feeds right into the Woodrow Wilson administration. I mean, that's what he basically was. He was like a progressive Christian. He was an odd figure because he was kind of a Southern traditionalist and a progressive Northern Christian at the same time. It was a weird mixture of ideas that guy had, but the as far as the economic development, I think that's an interesting question because the North, if there had not have been as rapid an expansion westward, the rate of economic development in the North might not have been quite as intense. And I think maybe America would not have emerged as a leading economic power as quickly as it did. I think the European nations would have retained the upper hand in terms of the just dominating international trade and the world economy. Britain and Germany and some of the others. So that probably one of the negative side effects for the United States, if the South had won, would be that the United States as a whole probably would not have developed as much wealth as rapidly as it did. But there would have been a lot more positive features in other ways.
Well, yeah, one of the interesting things as well is I think it's quite likely that in a context like that, the United States would play the role of France after the Franco-Prussian War. We would have a sense of revanchism for the Deep South, and we would blame the French and the British for letting them get away. So I think that in one sense you could see a sort of northern revanchism. And the one thing that you'd also see is with two potentially hostile republics, you'd see probably mass conscription a lot more frequently than you did historically. And a lot of European immigrants fled Europe to avoid mass conscription. But if mass conscription were a part of the North and the South, you might not have seen as much European immigration because they're like, well, it sucks over there too. So maybe we shouldn't be immigrating as much. And I would also tend to agree with George J.F.C. Fuller that even if the South does abolish slavery at some later date, a society based on slavery and sharecropping is not a society that's going to encourage European immigration. You may get some, But I think the immigrants that do come, the lion's share would still go to the north, and that would lead to a economic development gap. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's possible that mass conscription would have been more commonly used, because he would have had two republics that were essentially enemies with each other side by side. So they may have been more likely to actually maintain large-scale armies for the purpose of as a deterrent to attack by the other. In fact, they could have fought again. It's possible they could have fought again. That happened, of course, between Britain and America after the War of Independence. They had a repeat of that in 1812. So it's certainly possible the North and the South could have fought again, which I think that would have had negative consequences, certainly in terms of economic development in the Western Hemisphere, or North America. But the immigration issue, you had a huge wave of immigrants in the United States. First in the early 19th century from Ireland and Germany and places like that, some of whom were escaping famine and all of that. And as you were saying, by the mid-19th century, German Americans were actually the largest ethnic group even then. But in the late 19th century, you started getting a lot of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Italy and from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Russia and Lithuania and all of those places. If the level of economic development had not been as high in the United States at that point, I don't think you would have seen as many immigrants either, because the immigrants mostly came from these places either in search of employment or because they thought they could make money some other way, through business or trade or something in the United States, or as you were saying, to escape the military conscription in Europe. And religious freedom was another thing too. All of those things figured into the waves of immigration that we saw in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the whole Ellis Island period of immigration. So a slower rate of economic development in North America, when North America is split up into two republics on the Atlantic region, probably would have slowed down the rate of immigration. And I think in many ways we would even today have probably a more ethnically or culturally homogenous society than we do if we had not experienced those late waves of immigration that happened back in the Gilded Age.
One question, one interesting thing as well, is prior to the South leaving the Union, a lot of our early wars as a republic were advocated by Southerners, right? So the War of 1812, you had the Southerners who wanted to get Florida from the Spanish, then a British ally, along with the frontiersmen who wanted to get Canada. And then, of course, many of the Midwest, well, they would be the Westerners at that point, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and the East Coast New Englanders opposed the Mexican War, and it tended to be more of the Southerners in the frontier that advocated the war with Mexico to get new states to be slave states. Furthermore, prior to the Civil War, there was the Order of the Golden Circle, where they wanted to basically control the slave cash crop society of the Caribbean. Do you think that if the South had left the Union, the 19th century might be a century of the South trying to gobble up the Caribbean to corner the cash crops? And then also secondarily, does this mean that Maximilian of Mexico is still in charge? Because the French only leave Mexico because of threat of Union invasion. But if the South is a French ally, and certainly Juarez would not have been, his radical politics would have been an anathema to the Confederate gentry, might they have propped up Maximilian as a part of this broader Latin American expansion project?
Well, that's an interesting point. The South, I think, would have been more aggressively expansionist into the Caribbean and into Latin America, because I think Southern agricultural interests would have wanted to gain hegemony over a lot of those regions and the resources that were there. As far as the relationship with Mexico, I'm not sure how that would have unfolded. I think you might quite possibly would have seen a greater level of conflict between the Southern Republic, the CSA, or whatever it would have been called, and European powers that would have had an interest in colonizing the Latin American region. One thing I think that would have been a consequence of the loss of the loss by the North and the victory by the South would be if you had a less powerful United States and a United States that was actually split into two countries, the European powers of the time probably would have adopted a more expansive or expansionist or active role in Latin America, trying to dominate the economic life of Latin America. I think the southern states being an agrarian agricultural society, I think that would have possibly brought them into greater conflict with European powers over geopolitical considerations in Latin America. And I think that quite likely Mexico might have been, as you were saying, it could have become something like a puppet of the CSA if the CSA had survived, along with Cuba and Puerto Rico and all those places that eventually became American possessions and territories as a result of the Spanish-American War. And in that way, the outcome of the Spanish-American War might have actually been very similar to what would have happened in this kind of scenario, only it would have been the expansionism of the South that was really the key impetus for that. And then the North would have continued to have tried to expand westward, whereas the South may have tried to expand southward, but you would have seen more conflicts between the North and the South further west. Rather than on the Mason-Dixon line, you would perhaps see more conflicts in the regions that are now places like Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and Southern California, all of that, because I think the North and the South would have both wanted control over those regions. And both of them would have continued to expand, the South into the further South and into the Southwest, and then the North, in the same route that it actually took, and just expanding all the way to the Pacific coast. So who knows? I mean, maybe the North and the South would have fought yet another time on the West Coast over some of those territories.
Well, one of the interesting things is, I think much like with France and Germany in what happened in our timeline, you would have had a sort of, given the way the imperial structure was set up with all these competing great powers, I think there would have been a quote, First World War, if you want to call it that, sometime in the early 20th century, except it would have happened on the North American continent as well. I think that's almost unavoidable, just given the nature of that system of aggressive, expansionist, militarist empires. But the key difference here is you don't have one nation that breaks the system, right? The United States was so powerful, so overwhelming, that whichever side it joined was automatically going to win by default. And so the United States massively affected that. Now, this wouldn't happen if the South had left the Union. And North America would be less important to overall geopolitical concerns. But I still think such a conflict would have developed. On the eve of such a conflict, I think the South, however much land it got in Latin America, which is dependent, of course, upon how much the Europeans are happy with them having, would have looked a lot like Austria-Hungary or Russia. It would have been multi-ethnic and polyglot with a shrinking planter minority. It would have looked, on paper, probably would have looked very rich with all these export crops and some strategic industries that they might have developed on the side with British help. But I think that would have been a sort of cover for a deeper malaise of not only to have to deal with the Negro problem, but also mestizos and Indians. And so they would have been outnumbered by these minorities all throughout the Caribbean. And we also know that in Latin America, revolutionary struggle by the lower classes. Again, Juarez was the first native-born Indian to be elected president of Mexico. And we saw what that led to, where the conservatives invited the French in order to protect their interests, led to a brutal civil war. So it's quite likely that throughout Latin America, the eternal conservative liberal divide would have led to internal rebellions within the CSA, which would have left it vulnerable in the long, drag-out war of attrition. It's quite likely you might have had a communist-style revolution in the CSA after it's exhausted in a war with America. All these minorities rise up and for communism. That's at least, I think, one. It's certainly far more plausible than. Well, let me back it up. In the history of alternative history and how the South leaves the Union, there tends to be two popular theories. One is, and this was popular before the 1960s, when there was still a shared identity of American, that the North and the South would inevitably come back together peacefully and form one great republic. There were a couple prominent histories written on that prior to 1960. Since 1960, There tends to be more of a conflict-oriented view of North and South. Most famously, Harry Turtledove's 191 series, which is basically based around the Order of 191 not being lost at Antietam. So the Confederates win there big time. And I think the one is a little too rosy in that North and South would get back together. And the other one, I think Turtledove is a little too... I mean, he goes so far as to make the Confederates the new Nazis. It's a little ridiculous. But I think there would be some conflict somewhere between those two extremes of really cheery and really apocalyptic. And I think in all likelihood, such a conflict would lead to a rise of socialism in that region. All these minority groups that feel oppressed by the Southern planter class and the European imperialists would lead to more uprisings, especially in a long war like we would see in the First World War, where these nations get exhausted. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, to some degree, as far as the history of Latin America, that is similar to what happened in the sense that we didn't obviously have the two republics in the United States with an expansionist South, but we did have the achievement of the consolidation of the United States into a continental empire that in turn started to exercise hegemony over Latin America in the same way that a traditional or a colonial empire typically does, although with the United States it tended to be more economic hegemony and through client states and stuff like that rather than creating outright colonies. But I think the end results of that were still the same. And all throughout the 20th century in Latin America, you actually saw the rise of socialism and class struggle type movements and all of that. It could be argued that the Mexican Revolution was the first Marxist revolution. I heard that said once, but you all throughout Latin America, throughout the 20th century, you had Marxist guerrilla movements and leftist and socialist and populist governments coming to power. So I don't know that all of that would have been dramatically different. I think it may have, the shape of it may have assumed a somewhat different form, but in terms of the actual content, not necessarily. I mean, if you look at Latin American politics today, all of the Latin American countries are now Western-style liberal democracies, except Cuba. That's really the one that's not. But the rest of them pretty much are basically Western democracies with a parliamentary system and elections and all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the parties that they have, though, you see that their electoral politics is a lot more similar to Europe than to America in the sense that, you have their center-right parties tend to be very similar to the Christian Democrats in some of the European countries, and in a lot of Latin American countries, the left-wing parties tend to be the far left. I mean, you actually have socialist and communist parties or parties that have similar beliefs as competitive political parties in Latin America in ways that you don't really in the United States. So, in fact, I've had this conversation a lot with people, Americans who really understand nothing about how electoral politics works in other parts of the world. The range of politics in the United States is actually very narrow. We have two major parties, and we have one that's a center-right liberal party, the Republicans, and one that's a left liberal, neoliberal party, the Democrats. A lot of people mistakenly believe that the Democrats are socialist or communist or something like that. And a lot of people mistakenly believe that the Republicans are a historic right-wing party or, fascist or something like that. That's silly. But in a lot of countries with an electoral democracy, you do find parties with those kinds of ideas that are somewhat competitive, at least on the margin. Brazil is a good example. I mean, the Workers' Party until recently was the ruling party. A de facto Marxist party was the ruling party, and they were elected. And you see in a lot of the other countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Argentina, a number of others. You had serious leftist parties that have been elected to the presidency and things like that in recent years. And then you also have right-wing parties in Latin America that are very similar to the traditional caudillo systems you found in Latin America in the past, or European-style fascists, or reactionaries like the Franco Salazar model. You find that in Latin America as well. And you don't find any of that in the United States. So the United States is a much different political culture than Latin America. But I'm not sure that would be different if the South had had won the war. Though I think that it probably would have developed in a similar way. The form may have been different, but I don't know if the content would have been much different.
Well, as far as future unification, it could be actually the South might rejoin the North for fear of a communist revolution from their Latin American holdings. They might feel like they overreached, and for the landholders to keep their property, they wouldn't be able to do it themselves, and they might say, well, maybe we have to go back to the Yanks for that.
Well, that could be the case because you saw a lot of that during the period, the anti-colonial period of the late 20th century. You actually saw, for a better term, the bourgeois conservatives, the parties of capitalism, and the feudal parties, the right-wing reactionary feudal parties, actually aligning themselves with each other in a lot of Latin American countries against insurgencies by the far left, by socialists, actual socialists and communists, and the guerrilla armies and that kind of stuff as well. You certainly saw that. So I can think that could have pushed the the more traditional agrarian South and the industrial capitalist North closer together in a way that if they both felt threatened somehow by the rise of, say, the far left in Latin America.
Now, I think that there probably would have been a World War I front in North America in this situation. What would you think the breakdown would be of trench warfare in Virginia, Kentucky, and Arkansas? I think in a lot of ways, North America would be like the Eastern Front against Russia. It's so large and vast that with the few exceptions, you really couldn't get trench warfare. So maybe Virginia, maybe in Kentucky, but not in out west. That would be more like the Eastern Front with Russia, where the Union numbers would become much more important because the Union could outmaneuver the Confederates in those areas there. Furthermore, the lines might stretch all the way to the Pacific, with Mexico being a Confederate ally. Also, if Canada's involved on the side of the British, a Confederate ally, that's a huge mess. Like, how would that even unfold?
Yeah, I don't know if there would have been a World War I front in North America or not. I don't know that the ruling classes or elites, power elites in the two republics would have necessarily seen something like that as being in their own interest. There would have had to have been some kind of catalyst, I think, to trigger that. I'm not sure that would have been something, that what happened, the explosion that happened in Europe would have necessarily been transplanted to North America. I think it would have had to have been more than that. There would have had to have been some serious reason for that.
Would Northern revanchism have been enough?
Possibly, if they thought that there was a serious chance. Let's say if the South, if the CSA had, say, become aligned with Germany, or perhaps with some of the reactionary, more traditional European countries, Spain or some of those, Portugal, and then America had been aligned with England and France, and that had been a major dividing line, possibly. So yeah, revanchism could have played into it. Although, there's also the question of, what would have been the fruits of anticipated victory versus the losses that would have been incurred, if it didn't go so well. I think that I tend to think I think the elites, the northern elites of that time of 1917 would have been somewhat more apprehensive about fighting an actual war in North America on their own soil, as opposed to getting into one on the other side of the ocean. In fact, I think one reason why American foreign policy has become so interventionist over the last century or so is that it's possible to have American interventionism with relatively low consequences. The United States really is not risking a retaliatory invasion or retaliatory bombing raids and all of these kinds of things that take place when you invade a country that's, say, on your borders or on the same continent. When you've still got two oceans separating you, you can go overseas and engage in these kinds of overseas military adventures with a higher level of safety and lower cost than you can if something's going to happen right there in your own backyard. So I do think that's something of a deterrent. Although, if you look at other nations, it hasn't been much of a deterrent to a lot of them. So maybe not.
Well, I guess I do have one point to add here, though, is prior to the Civil War, the United States was very territorially expansionist on the North American continent. The war with Mexico, the basically coup d'etat in Florida, where Jackson just invades it and says it's mine. And so
the Trail of Tears unfolded like that too. The Indian Exclusion Act, that was the legislative foundation for the Trail of Tears, was actually declared illegal by the Supreme Court. And Andrew Jackson said, fine, okay, they made their decision, let them enforce it, meaning, well, they obviously can't enforce it, so we're going to do what we want.
So exactly. I guess it could go either way. Would North America become more, because that's this is like the dark side of the split up of the country. The people that are supporting the Union narrative would say, oh, well, that would just lead to all of Europe's troubles coming over here, and there'd be large bloodbaths on the North American continent as well as in Europe. Now, even if they're right, there is one positive that comes from that. The Americans are prone to intervention because war is cheap. And except for the U.S. Civil War, we didn't have to pay a high price. If there are multiple wars with an independent confederacy, and even if we do win at the end of the day, that might, the Americans might no longer have a stomach for that kind of a bloodbath. It's like, wow, that was terrible. Why did we do that again?
Yeah, well, I think that the experience of having multiple wars like that may have made Americans more tired of war. I mean, we've seen that in recent history, where after the Vietnam War, the lasting impact of the Vietnam War has been that it delegitimized the draft politically. I mean, 45 years later, we still haven't had the draft for a while. Also, Americans after that became increasingly averse to war if there's any casualties on their side. I mean, even after September 11th and all that, as soon as the casualty mark started reaching, say, 1,000 in Afghanistan and Iraq and all of that, people started turning against the war. So Americans today tend to be relatively aren't willing to accept war if there's any real cost on their side. And it's really been that way since the war in Vietnam. So if the Americans had experienced several high-cost wars like that in the 19th century in North America, I think it certainly would have made Americans more less enthusiastic about international warfare, that is, wars in Europe and Asia. I don't think it would have been as easy for the elite or the state or whomever to stir up war fever in the way that they did during the two world wars. This whole idea we're going to go fight the barbarian Huns and all of that kind of stuff, make the world safe for democracy. Those ideas probably would not have been sellable to a culture that was not as directly familiar to a culture that was as more directly familiar with, just what real war is really like.
Yeah, exactly. I think in this situation, the big winners would obviously be Japan and Germany. Since the United States isn't meddling in the Pacific, it's naturally going to fall under Japan's sphere of influence. Communism is quite likely not going to develop in Asia. Even if it is a resistance move to Japan, the Japanese have the stomach to fight it out. The Sino-Japanese War was a massive bloodbath. And the Japanese were more than willing to fight that war. So if the communists want to have an insurrection in China, they might be like, yeah, who cares? We're gonna take you out. The Middle East is going to be massively different. The only nation that had a sensible strategy for the Middle East in the past century was Germany, supporting the Ottoman Empire. The Middle East today cannot be ruled without dictators. Bashar al-Assad's dad at Homs in the 1980s just slaughtered 20,000 people to break the back of the Islamic Brotherhood. Saddam Hussein was notorious for using brutal strongman tactics to maintain Iraq. And of course, the Turks were also notorious for this. But can you imagine a Middle East without Israel, without Arab, these feuding Arab states? Prior to World War I, the last major outbreak of violence was about 80 years earlier in the 1820s between Ottoman Empire and Persia. It was mostly on the periphery of Iraq. And they had about 70 years of peace. There's no reason to assume that would have been any different. And certainly a Ottoman Empire under the auspices of the Germans, led by the Young Turks, modernist, forward-thinking leaders, unlike the reactionary despots of the Middle East today, would it have been, again, the Turks are basically reasonable people. They joined NATO and during the Cold War. They were a part of the European balance of power as far back as Napoleon. And the European strategy was to keep Turkey around, which is why you had the Crimean War. England and France didn't want to see Turkey go down. And they kind of threw it all out the window. And the Middle East just totally became a war zone. I mean, there's really no end in sight to the complete disaster that is the Middle East. And all of this could have been avoided had the Ottoman Empire been allowed to continue. And, with German advisors and oil development, they could have continued throughout the rest of the century, which would have been a far preferable position than what actually happened. And again, the Ottoman defeat is directly related to U.S. intervention in World War I. So the Middle East is much better off. Asia doesn't go communist, which is much better off. Eastern Europe, well, look, even if the Germans have to send Lenin to Russia to get Russia to bail out, they're not going to let the Soviet Union develop for 20 years on their border. They're probably going to intervene in the Civil War once they beat the French to then make sure the whites win. So communism is the big loser. You might still see communist revolutions or socialist revolutions in Latin America, but being poor peasant societies, they won't have much effect on the world stage except possibly driving the Confederacy back into the arms of the Union. So we have no communism, no fascism. The Middle East is basically peaceful. Most of the genocides that we saw in the 20th century are not likely to have happened. The radical utopian Marxists and the radical utopian liberals are thoroughly discredited. It seems like there might be more low-level conflicts, like you might think like the Franco-Prussian War or the Crimean War, where these are fought for limited objectives between great powers with rules of engagement, much like the Cold War battles like in Vietnam, except there's no guerrilla insurgency going on. It's just these limited struggles. And so in the long run, while it might lead to more conflict in North America, it would lead to less conflict in the world overall. And I think since without the United States to fundamentally tip the balance of power one way or the other, you might see a lot of the world by the 1950s just getting tired of the imperialist game. They just kind of are exhausted from all these exertions and the cost of the empires. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, the example that you gave of the Ottoman Empire is important because that's something that often gets lost in these discussions. But the destruction of the Ottoman Empire was really the beginning of the disaster that the Middle East is today. What happened was that once the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, you had the British and other European powers coming in and carving up the Ottoman Empire into all kinds of unnatural boundaries that had nothing to do with the natural, cultural, or geographical, or linguistic, or whatever boundaries of those of that region. And those countries have all been, in conflict with each other ever since. And plus, they've been pawns in the various struggles between the Asian and European powers. They were all, for example, during the Cold War. And what has happened in those countries has been one disaster after the other. For instance, it's interesting to actually go back and look at photographs and videos of some of the Middle Eastern countries, even from the middle part of the 20th century. And you see that even places like Afghanistan were once, relatively moderate places to be, before the kind of extremism that you see today started to really become deeply ingrained. I've had interesting conversations about this with people from the Middle East. Like a lot of times I've gotten in an Uber or a taxi or something, and the driver is from Iraq or Yemen or Jordan or one of these places. And so I'm always interested in getting the perspective on this from somebody that's there. And virtually the universal consensus that I get from people from the Middle East is that the Middle East today is crap. One guy was saying, well, the only Arab country worth living in today is Jordan. The rest of them are destroyed. And one of them, one guy was saying, well, it's the Saudis that really caused the problems because they were the ones that were spreading this kind of Wahhabist, Salafist crusade throughout the Middle East. And of course, none of them like Israel. And then, then you've got these rivalries between the Shia and Sunni and all of that. But I have actually raised the question with some of these guys before, some of these people, well, what about the Ottoman Empire? Would you think the Middle East would have been better as a better place today if the Ottoman Empire had remained intact? And I get very few who say, no, the Middle East is better today because of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Empire. I've never really heard anybody. I mean, a few times I've come across people who obviously hate the Turks who may have made that kind of argument, but you generally don't. I generally don't hear that from people from that region. They basically say, we've had one disaster after another over the last century. But the Turks were, as you were saying, they were a fairly reasonable empire in the sense that they afforded some level of autonomy and self-determination to different ethnic groups and religions and all of the traditional culture you find in the Middle East. And the Ottoman Empire wasn't a bad place to be. I mean, in fact, even much of the Middle East throughout much of its history, you can go back and find writing from past centuries where people talk about the Middle East and like Westerners who had traveled to the Middle East and saying that it's not that it's not that bad of a place. It's actually very advanced in some ways. It's got a lot of benefits to it. And nowadays, when anyone thinks of the Middle East, what they think of is just endless war, endless terrorism, endless poverty, endless state repression, endless jihadism, that kind of stuff. So I mean, that's that area of the world, arguably that area of the world and sub-Saharan Africa are the worst parts of the world today in terms of quality of life and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it seems like it's been all downhill since the decline of the Ottomans.
Yeah, so I think we're nearing the end of the hour, but what we've explored here is that it's not at all self-evident that the world would have been worse off with a divided North America and with the German victory in the First World War. And in many cases, there are parts of the world that would be much better off today than they are now. So do you have anything you'd like to leave us with, Keith?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to explore these alternative histories because we do get this other line pushed so fervently. In all of my time that I've spent around academia, I very rarely hear anybody say a critical word about the First World War, or the argument for certainly I've never heard anybody from the intellectual class say, well, maybe it would have been better if the South had won the Civil War. I mean, it's pretty much taken as a revealed religion that this is the victory of the North and the victory of the Allies in the First World War are help make the world the great place that it is today, supposedly. So some of this alternative history I do think is really interesting, and it's worth considering some of these kinds of things because it provides certain insights to some of the problems we have today. I mean, a lot of the problems we have today with American foreign policy are rooted in these things. It's still the same way of thinking. It's you have the neocons, the neoliberals, the liberal internationalists who make the foreign policy, who are still thinking the same way they were thinking during the Civil War, during the First World War, during the post-war period, and they're still doing the same thing with the same results.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith. It's always a pleasure.
All right.
This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing out.